Hello, I'm Dr. Garrett Boyer, and welcome to Gospel Minded. We're going to spend the next few minutes talking about themes of psychology, behavioral health, our emotions, especially as these topics relate to our gospel each Sunday. This isn't meant to be any sort of substitute for counseling or spiritual direction or those kind of practices that you might be engaged in. But we know so often the spiritual life and our psychological well-being go hand in hand. And so today, here we are, Palm Sunday. We've made it this far through Lent. And I think the message for Palm Sunday is such a fascinating one because it's something that a lot of us have experienced at various points in our life. Here on this Palm Sunday, the gospel reading or the gospel readings reflect our Lord entering Jerusalem in triumph, riding a donkey to proclamations of Hosanna in the highest, and the people rejoicing at his presence lay palms before him, a tremendous celebration of our Lord's presence in that entry into Jerusalem. And then what happens after that? That's it. The Lord assumes the throne and lives happily ever after, and nothing else happens after that? No, not at all. Just days later, he's betrayed by his friends, sentenced unjustly, crucified, dies. So what a stark juxtaposition in just a span of a few days. Here's Jesus, this figure of Christ, triumphantly coming into Jerusalem to praise and accolades, and just days later, the world looks so much different. And I think that happens with us too, so many times and in so many different ways. Things will look very good in our life. We'll be doing well with relationships, with work. We'll feel like we're kings of the world or queen of our own castle. We'll have this sense that everything is all situated just right and put together and squared away. And when that happens, that's tremendous and that's great that you have that in your life at that time. But so often what happens is then something happens and it can change all of that sense of security, of prosperity, of well-being. Sometimes it can happen that it's an idle Tuesday afternoon and you get that phone call, and what is it? Bad news. Maybe you got passed over for a promotion. Maybe a loved one has gotten a bad diagnosis from a doctor. Maybe there was some sort of natural disaster and you lost your home. You know, tragedy can look so many different ways to so many of us. And yet we all experience some kind of tragedy, some sort of kind of life-altering event at some point or another in the course of our life. And so I want to speak about that today. We're talking about the big things. We've had other videos where we talk about the minor inconveniences and the little things that frustrate us, and those are important to talk about too. But here we are at Palm Sunday. Let's talk about the big stuff that can happen in our life. For Jesus, it was a matter of life and death. So today on this edition of Gospel Minded, let's talk about those life and death things that come up periodically in the course of our life. In philosophy, this would sort of be looked at, and it depends on what philosopher you're reading. But I'm thinking about like the medieval philosopher Boethius. He kind of looked at this idea of the wheel of fortune, this idea of the chance, and in this mindset, it's as though life is on this constant sort of wheel, and what happens or what doesn't happen is sort of because of fortune and luck. And the thought was that sometimes you're at the top of this wheel, and sometimes you're at the bottom of this wheel, and it's just sort of the luck of the draw about what's going to happen to you, what kind of hand you're going to get dealt. You know, that's a approach. That's an approach we can think about when we contemplate what's going on in our life, especially when bad things happen. It doesn't leave a ton of room for hope or reconciliation with the Lord if it's just all because of chance. Now, in spiritual terms, the spiritual writer Ignatius of Loyola talked about this idea of spiritual consolation versus desolation. And in this, he means that there are times in life where we'll have these experiences of true blessedness and attachment and a closeness to the Lord. And those are wonderful times. And when we're in the midst of that spiritual consolation, we need to cherish it, bask in it, appreciate and love it, because there will be times when we are not in that state of spiritual consolation, but we'll be in a state of desolation, where we'll have that ache, that longing, that desire for what at one time we had. And Ignatius's guidance is, when we're in the midst of desolation, to look back to that reservoir of the blessedness that we had when we were in the state of consolation. So whether we look at this from that kind of philosophical standpoint of Boethius, that wheel of fortune, whether it's through the lens of St. Ignatius, consolation versus desolation, at the end of the day, there's a sense that they're both kind of getting at the same thing, which is that in life, sometimes things are really good, and then other times in life, things are really bad. And in psychology, we don't really have a term for that phenomenon necessarily. I just kind of call it life, because we know inevitably that the experience of human existence does indeed have these ups and downs, these turbulences throughout the course of life. And sometimes that turbulence can be really rough and very, very rocky, to the tune of losing a loved one to death, losing a job, hearing about a significant illness, whatever it might be. We know what that turbulence looks like when it happens to us, and it's not good. So what do we do when we have these moments in our life? It's great when we're in that state of feeling like we're riding in to Jerusalem on the donkey, to accolades. That's great. We all love that feeling, and we know what that feels like when we experience it. But what about when we get to that Good Friday moment, where we're feeling like we're being treated unfairly or unjustly, like we don't have a friend in the world, where we feel as though we're being nailed to a cross? What do we do in that moment? Well, I wish that there was a playbook or a strategy guide. I wish there was a magic wand that we could wave and it would solve these problems and would give us the answer to all of these questions. There isn't. But there are some things that we can do. So you remember a few weeks ago I talked about the personality tests and the folks that had this measure of openness to different experiences. The folks that are more open to experiences in life are probably going to fare a little bit better when the unexpected happens, or when something out of the blue comes and disrupts their life. That being said, there are things that we can do to try and help us get a better grasp of being able to be open when something unexpected comes our way. Thomas Lynch was still is alive, is a theorist who came up with this theme and this instruction called radically open dialectical behavioral therapy. And if you've heard of dialectical behavioral therapy, it's great, and it builds off of that. So this theme of being radically open, this sense that we have only so much control, and in life, some of that sense of control has to be relinquished for us to really truly flourish and be free. Because who has control over every single thing all the time? Nobody. And especially if you're the kind of person who is over-controlled. And I want to be conscientious of what I'm saying here, because it is good to have some sense of control. But we all know those individuals who act as though they can control everything all the time. Those kinds of folks that are over-controlled, this approach to therapy can be very beneficial and useful for them. But all of us, when we're in the midst of that whirlwind, to be able to relinquish the idea that I can control what's happening here and now can be very useful, because when we're in the midst of the cyclone of challenging life circumstances, we may feel as though we've lost a lot of control. And so our ODBT is sort of rooted in the approach of the serenity prayer. If you've heard that before, it's, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, to change the things that I can, and to know the difference between the two. It's a beautiful prayer, and I love that approach to serenity, that God, we really don't have control to some things that are happening in our life. So help me to have a serene spirit in the midst of that. And then grant me the courage to change the things that I can. So when we are in the midst of whatever dire situation may come our way, it's not that we should just relinquish hope and give up and throw up our arms and say, there's nothing I can do, I'm out, there's nothing left for me to do here. No, we do want to press on, move forward, change the things that we can in those spiritual terms to get back to that state of the consolation, the blessedness. And yet at the same time, we want to be conscientious that we're not trying to falsely grasp at control when we really don't have that kind of control. I hope this makes sense. In my mind, it makes a lot of sense. But I'm also not in a state right now where I feel like the world around me is crumbling. And I get it. It's harder to practice this when you're in the midst of that. And yet, here we are, this message for today, this Palm Sunday, very clear. This is an image of what life is like. There are times where we are riding high, and then sometimes it doesn't take too much longer after that to feel like our world is crashing all around us. It happened to our Lord. It happens to so many of us. And what can we do? We can ask in humility for God the courage to be serene, and that we can be granted serenity with those things that we cannot change, that we will have the courage to change the things that we can, and that we'll have wisdom to know the difference. And that in the midst of whatever circumstance, we can turn to the Lord to be a refuge for the benefit of our souls, for the benefit of our minds, and for ultimately the glory of the Lord and the kingdom that we're a part of. So I hope this is helpful. Happy Palm Sunday. I hope you have a good week, and I'll see you next time. I'm Dr. Garrett Boyer for Gospel Minded. Take care.